Unfortunately, I wasn't organized enough to get these into Wade to get them on the CD. They will be up on the website once everything's collected. You are aware that all the convention MP3 recordings and handouts eventually appear on the website in the members' corner. And eventually, by that I mean like maybe a month after the convention, they're usually all up there. So anything that you don't find on the CD and you don't manage to get as a paper handout, you can always find there. Oh yes, I forgot about that. If you have your computer with you, I do have copies of that on. I've got about 3 thumb drives of those files on it. So if you've got your computer with you, I'll give you the thumb drive and you can copy them. Or if you want to give me your thumb drive, I'll copy it off my computer. Well, this is a gratifying, almost scary turnout. Let's get started. So I have this statement to read here to make sure that when you're on the EC actually listens to every one of these recordings. And it's amazing if somebody doesn't read this thing up front, you're not really sure what the hell you're listening to. You don't know who's talking or what the topic is or anything. So I'm doing this just so I know what's going on when I listen to this. Good morning. Welcome to the 40th CALLERLAB convention in Cary, North Carolina. Today is, state the date, Tuesday, March 26th, my watch says. I hope that's right. And this is the session on dancing by definition. I am your name. I'm Barry Clasper. I'm your moderator and your panelist. I'm the whole shebang. If that scares you, you're free to leave at this time. Those of you who saw the title, Dancing by Definition, didn't read the abstract, may find that you're disappointed by the content of this presentation. Because if you're expecting that I'm going to, pull some definition out of the definition book and look at it with a lawyer's eye for loopholes and subtle meanings and nuances that we can explore, that isn't what's going to happen. I'm going to be talking about the real definition that dancers use when they're dancing. I'll start with the provocative statement that every dancer dances every call to the definition. Anybody believe that? It's not the definition that's in our book. But obviously, if they didn't have something that they were using to figure out what to do, they wouldn't know what to do. If I squared up a set and I said, snarf the garfle, they'd all just stand there, right? They wouldn't have any idea what to do. So every dancer has something in their head that is their set of instructions for doing that call. So that's their definition, and they always dance by that definition. So what this session is going to be about is exploring where do those definitions come from, how do they get built, how do you work with them, because obviously if you're working with the definitions that are in the dancers' heads, then you got to do some exploration every time you call to try and figure out what those definitions look like, and therefore what you can do with your choreography while you're calling to those dancers. Every dancer's definition is somewhat unique. You believe that? So let's explore this a little bit. How many of you were in my Great Expectations presentation last year or heard it on the tapes? A few of you. You'll be pleased to know that this is almost exactly the same. So you're free to leave too. That presentation was exploring basically some reading that I'd been doing about the way our minds are organized. There's been a lot of cognitive research over the years, the last 10 to 15 years, that have really shed a lot of light on how our minds are organized and how our brains work. And some of it is really pertinent for our square dance activity. And understanding a little bit about it helps us a lot in kind of framing how we work with dancers. So I'm going to give you a brief recap of that to start off. So those of you who heard it all last year, you can zone out for a few minutes. And then we'll go into how does that apply to how we work with definitions with our current dancers. So here's the nature of the theory. This is popularly documented in a couple of books that you can get. They've both been on the bestseller list for a while. One is a book by Daniel Kahneman titled Thinking Fast and Slow, which is basically what I drew all my ideas from for last year's presentation. Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winning psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics. And he won it because the research that he did that is documented in this book demonstrated that the models that economists were using to predict the behavior of people in marketplaces was totally wrong. People didn't make decisions based on what economists thought they made decisions on, and therefore their models left something to be desired. And they gave him a prize for that, which is amazing. People usually don't like to be debunked that way. Another book was by Malcolm Gladwell. I'm sure most of you have heard of him. He's written a number of them, called Blink. And it was basically about the same idea, that we all have a portion of our minds which are dedicated to, quote, fast thinking, or making decisions very, very rapidly, literally in the blink of an eye. We have mechanisms in our brains that are designed to constantly monitor our surroundings, both instantaneously, like as we're right now, you're all listening to what I'm saying for a while anyway, and you're aware of what's going on in the room, you're kind of aware of what the people in the room are doing and where they're sitting. You're always gathering this context. Where am I? What am I doing? And it's being fed into this section of your brain that's trying to figure out what's going on and what you need to do about it. And it generates relatively instantaneous decisions and evaluations so that if something happens that you need to react to, you can react to it. And so this is the part of our brain that evolved when we had to worry about, animals charging out of the bush to eat us, or maybe finding an animal so that we could go and eat. It's a very, very early part of our evolution. All animals have this to some extent. But the human part of that, the human version of that is very sophisticated. This section of our mind is capable of making very, very sophisticated evaluations and coming up with literally instantaneous answers that kind of surface in our conscious minds. And we've all had this happen, right? You've looked at something and you just, bang, something comes into your head. It's either the answer to the problem, or it's the decision about what to do, or it's your assessment about what's going on. I'm sure many of you have expertise in some sort of a field. You may be an accountant, or maybe you're an art expert. The beginning of Malcolm Gladwell's book, he relates the story of a museum that had acquired a really rare piece of sculpture. And there were only a few what am I looking for? There were only a few of these types of sculpture in the world, and they thought that they had one, and they had it evaluated by scientific means, and they put all kinds of instruments on it, and they carbon dated it and all that kind of stuff, and they were convinced that it was real. But one day, an art expert, a person who was an expert in this type of sculpture, came through and looked at it and said, "There's something wrong with this. It's not right. Have you paid for this yet?" And then that happened several more times. Several other art experts just looked at this thing and said, "It's not right. There's something wrong with it." And yet all these tests had shown that it was the right date, and that all the right tools had been used to do it, and all the things that they would look at to verify this. The documentation was good. It was all good, except these guys are looking at it and saying it's not right. And then that prompted them to do a lot more in-depth investigation, and they found out that indeed it was a fake. And the question was, how could these experts just look at it and say they couldn't articulate what was wrong? They just knew there was something wrong. And that's the nature of this part of our mind. We can look at something, it instantaneously evaluates a bunch of subtle cues that we're not even aware of, and it produces an answer. And when you're dealing with somebody like an art expert who's devoted hours and hours, literally tens of thousands of hours, to his subject, that can be a very, very complex, sophisticated evaluation. And indeed, that's what we think an expert is, right? An expert is somebody who has acquired so much information about a particular subject, whatever it is, that they can just look at something and come to an assessment. We rely on doctors to do that. They've done all this study. You can give them 3 or 4 things that, are bothering you, and they can, bang, hopefully, come up with what's going on. Think about a chess master. Have you seen these guys that play 10 people at once? They've got the 10 chess boards all arranged in a row, and they're walking up and down, and they look at the board and go bang, and they look at the board and they go bang. How are they doing that? They can look at the board, and because they've spent tens of thousands of hours, literally, looking at chess positions, and they've read all kinds of books about the strategies to use and whatnot, whatever they see on that board to them just pops out as a pattern that means something. It means, it means they're in a certain position relative to whether they're being attacked or they need to defend or what they need to do to avoid being attacked in a move or two. All of that just pops into their head. So we have this mechanism in our brain to do instantaneous evaluation. The psychologists have cleverly named it System 1. They didn't really put a lot of effort into coming up with something imaginative. It's also called the adaptive unconscious, which sounds a little grander, but nobody knows what the hell that means. So we're going to call it System 1 for the purposes of our talk here, just because it's easier to say. So we've got this thing in our head, System 1, that is doing all this instantaneous evaluation of what's going on around us and giving us ideas or evaluations as to what we should be doing next. Now let's look at square dancing. When people are dancing, how fast do we run our music? Tends to be, what, between 120 and 130 these days, in there somewhere. And we expect one step for each beat of music. That's what we tell people. So when somebody hears a call, what does that mean for how much time they have to figure out what they're going to do? They get a beat or two, depending on, just when you deliver it. So they've got half a second to a second, maybe, to do some evaluation about what to do. Oh, and by the way, if you're really calling to the music and you're trying to give them a smooth dance and it's not stop and go, while they're evaluating it, they're still doing something else, right? We do things like head square through 4, swing through, boys run around the girls, bend the line, and we might spit that out, more or less as a continuous stream of stuff. So the dancers were all moving as they were processing this command that's coming. So what system do you think is being used while that's going on? We can't stop and use System 2, which is our rational, self-aware part of our minds, what we think of as us. When you think of me, that's System 2. System 1 is unconscious. You don't really know what it's doing. It just keeps throwing stuff at you that you have to deal with your conscious mind. But there's a lot of stuff it doesn't even bother to throw at you. You just react to it. So System 2, when it does things, they're much slower. So the book that I mentioned, Thinking Fast and Slow, System 1 is the fast section, instantaneous, effortless answers, which are largely correct, but occasionally wrong. And System 2 is our rational self that says, okay, what is the nature of this problem, and what are the premises I need to work from? And it works very logically, stepwise, through some sort of a thought process to arrive at an answer. So if you're saying head square through 4, swing through, boys run, bend the line, blah, 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 you're not going through any rational thought process to figure out what you're going to do. It's all System 1. And what System 1 essentially is a really good pattern matching engine. System 1 is looking for patterns in the environment, and when it sees a pattern that it recognizes as something it's seen before, It retrieves from your memory everything it knows about that pattern. So square dance call is a pattern, right? You hear the words. Associated with those words, there is something in your mind. That something in your mind is the definition of the call, as far as that dancer understands the definition of the call. But it's not only the definition of the call, or the pattern that generated was not only the definition of the call. Just hearing the words wasn't all that was included in that pattern, because the dancer is also aware of what kind of room they're in, what they're doing at the time they're square dancing. They know what program or level they're dancing. You think the dancers know what level they're dancing and that it matters to them? How many of you think that? If you're on a C1 floor and you call teacup chain, what happens? Chaos and turmoil. Do you think challenge dancers don't know how to do a teacup chain? Put the same dancer on a plus floor and call it teacup chain and they'll do it. It's because they know if they're on a C1 floor, nobody calls teacup chain. That's not part of the surroundings that teacup chain fits in. So their model for teacup chain, their mental model says, nobody ever calls this call beyond plus. You might have occasionally get it at advanced. If you call it at advanced, you'll probably get some, startled looks like, oh my God, he called a teacup chain. You call it at C1 and they'll go like, I vaguely remember, there's something called teacup chain. But it doesn't belong in this world. Doesn't belong in this world. So the dancers have a context that they're evaluating the words that they hear in, and that includes the level that they're dancing. It also includes whatever they've heard before about this call, right? The memories they have about where this call's been used before. It includes the memories they have about where you've used it before. It includes the memories they have about what's been going on in the last few seconds. What have you been doing to lead up to this moment? It includes where all the other dancers happen to be and how they're moving and who they are. Because they know that Charlie always screws this call up. So I have to grab him by the hand and drag him with me or it ain't going to fly. They know all of that stuff. That's all part of what they're evaluating when they hear the words of that call. So this mental model that they're working with has a bunch of information in it. If you're thinking the mental model is sort of a stripped down version of whatever we wrote in the definition books, no. It's a hugely expanded version, hopefully, of what we've got in the definition books. There's a bunch more information in there. And every time the dancer encounters that call, that information gets added to. So every single encounter with the call, the dancer notices the circumstances that it happened in, they notice the result, and they sock it away. They add it to their impression of that call, and it gets used the next time. So what does this mean for us as square dance callers? It means be careful what you say. They're listening all the time. You may not think so when you say things like, no, your right hand, your right hand, your right hand. How many of you said that kind of stuff? And it's like, how can you be so dumb? I'm telling you what to do. But they really are listening. They may not have taken in the fact that this was their right hand, but they heard the words and it's in there somewhere. It may not be effective, but it's in there somewhere. So what I'm going to be talking about today, that was just by way of introduction. What I'm going to be talking about today is how do those mental models get formed? This thing in their head, whatever it is they're carrying around as a definition, how do they get built? How do they get modified? What does this mean for us in two arenas? The first is we all teach dancers at some stage. What does it mean for how we teach? Because it's hugely important for how we teach. And then if you're in the situation of you're calling to to dancers that you don't know very well. So if you're calling to somebody else's club filling in, or if you're calling at a convention or a festival or something and you got people in front of you that you don't know well, you need to figure out what the state of their definitions are, what have they got in their heads as their representation of the call, and how do you work with that? So how do you adjust your choreography to whatever their mental model is? And this is the nice thing about mental models. Remember I said they're always being added to? That means you can change them on the fly. So you can have the dancers walk into this tip with one mental model and finish the tip with a little different mental model. You can adjust them. So you can give them a fun dance experience by playing with these mental models. So we're going to talk about that kind of thing a little bit. Any questions before I go on? There's some handouts up here if you feel free to walk up. I don't mind you walking in front of me. Before I forget, I did a presentation yesterday as part of a panel on different but not destructive. I also have that handout up here because my handout for this session points at it. Like says you'll find other information or examples in this handout. So I have a few of those left and I put them up here too. But remember, if you do go and pull this off the website later, pull them both down because they're kind of related to one another. So let's look at how these mental models get built. What do you think the first step is in building a mental model of a call? Somebody teaches them the call. So how do we do that? Well, you get a bunch of people up on the floor, right? And we read the CALLERLAB definition to them, don't we? Unfortunately, most of our definitions are not really suited to that. If you just read the definition to the dancers, first of all, it wouldn't make sense at all to a lot of them. You need to interpret them through a certain eye sometimes for them to make sense. Secondly, a lot of people don't learn that way. We have different learning styles, right? Some people like to hear things. They hear things described to them and it sort of makes sense. Some people like to see things. They're visual learners. So when they see something happen, they can learn from that. Some people need to do it. You know, they learn from the way it feels. They're kinesthetic learners. And we all use all of those learning styles, but everybody prefers one mode over another. And hopefully, as you teach, you can kind of hit all those learning styles and present something which touches on all of them. And actually, that's not too hard the way we typically teach square dance calls, because we usually get some people up, we tell them what they're going to do, so that helps with the auditory learners. And then we'll have at least part of the square kind of do it, and so that helps the visual learners, and then eventually everybody's doing it, so that helps the kinesthetic learners, and hopefully it all sort of melds together eventually into something that's hit everybody's hot buttons. So that's kind of the process that we tend to use. Would you have anything to add to that, Dottie? Dottie's done a lot of work in this area. Dottie has a whole session on this afternoon, so if this has piqued your interest, it's called Effective Teaching this afternoon. So, first the caller says something, does something that, quote, teaches the call. And what does that actually become? Remember I said the dancer is always adding to this. So what you first teach them becomes the framework or the skeleton for everything that follows. So every time they encounter the call after that, it's affecting this framework somehow, or it is being affected by that framework. The way they interpret what they experience later is through the lens of that framework. So obviously a framework is really important. If you don't get that right, then things get kind of muddled later on. So you have to be really careful to impart just the right amount of information information that is absolutely correct, that isn't ever going to be contradicted by something they encounter later, unless what they encounter later is actually wrong. I mean, that never happens, right? They never go to another caller and hear something that's just wrong. But obviously that framework is really important. It is the foundation for everything that happens later. So you need to really be careful about that, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit. Now, every single encounter following that can do one of four things. It can reinforce what they originally learned. So the dancer hears the call, the circumstances are something that they've seen before, they make sense for the way they understand the call at the moment, and they think, oh, okay, I know what's going on. Again, I know what's going on. So it reinforces that framework and makes it stronger. The second thing that can happen is that they encounter something that extends the framework a little bit. So this could be the situation, I'll catch you in a minute. Or were you holding your hand up, or were you just scratching something? I saw a hand move over, that's all. Okay, good. That itching is allowed. You know? Something can happen that extends that framework a little bit. So it may be something that the original framework didn't explicitly talk about, but they realize, oh, hey, the framework can actually be either bent or extended or just modified a little bit so that it incorporates this. And that's kind of a gentle extension that it's not something they find really, upsetting. It's just like, oh, that's kind of neat. I didn't really think that could work that way, but it does. The third thing that it could do is refine the framework. Because, and the reason that's important is because, as I said, the dancers are always accumulating information and they're slugging it into this framework. And a lot of the information they'll accumulate is irrelevant. So, for example, let's take a call like scoot back. So how many of you teach scoot back this way? I've seen it taught this way many times. Head square through 4, touch 1/4. So you all know where you are, right? So we got boxes of 4, boys looking in, girls looking out. And we teach scoot back from there. And we may do it from there 2 or 3 more times. Now, what have the dancers absorbed from that? You may have told them the exact correct rule for scoot back. You may have talked about it in terms of leaders and trailers, which is the way the call is built, right? It's not a boys and girls call. It's not a right-handed or left-handed call. It's an inside hand call, a leader's call, a trailer's call. And in that mode, it's a box of 4 call. We won't talk about the quarter tag version of it at this point. So you may have actually given them the exact precise definition in the way you taught it. You may have used all the right words. And yet, what did they probably take away from that? If that's the way you taught it, say the first 4 or 5 times you ran them through it. They'll have picked up that it's right-handed, that the boys always go in, that it's done from ocean waves. They'll have picked all of that up. You didn't say a word about any of that, but it's there. And every time they encounter the call, they're absorbing information like that. If every time they hear slide through, they wind up either in facing lines or a facing 8 chain, that's all they think it can ever end in. And that's why people can't slide through today. We'll talk about that one in a little more detail too. So every time the dancers encounter the call, they're absorbing information, and they have sort of a little mental database that they're keeping about the call that says, well, I've encountered this call, I mean, this is obviously ridiculous, but I've encountered this call 356 times, and 354 of them it ended in facing lines. Therefore, it always ends in facing lines, because the other 2 were obviously mistakes. That's what they'll absorb. Now, I mean, nobody's keeping that kind of tally consciously in their head, but that's what's going on in these frameworks. Those sorts of statistics are being associated with it. So the way we use these calls is constantly modifying these mental models. And you can take a really good, strong teach gives them a really good framework, and you can gradually erase it by not really showing them all the implications of that framework again. So if you've got a, how many people do things like a sashayed past the ocean? And if you don't train the dancers in that, how well does it work? Not too well. How many of you teach past the ocean by the actual rule? And what do you think the rule is? Pass through, face into the box, touch quarter. Or not touch a quarter, just touch. The funny thing is, I had danced this call for years, and I was teaching the local gay club beginners class, and they started chanting, pass 'em, face 'em, teach or touch 'em, as their mantra for this call. And I found I started using that, you know, and I'm calling to other floors, and you sort of delicately explore, do you think I could do a sashayed past the ocean here and get away with it? Because it makes a real neat right and left grand get out if you can get them to do a right and left grand out of a wave. So you kind of explore that, and I found that I had started chanting at the dancers, you know, pass them, face them, touch them, and all of a sudden these floors that were really ragged doing a sashayed past the ocean would just do it. It's amazing. So these little verbal cues, they can make a difference even to people that don't know what they mean. But to get back to the point, we're always adding stuff to this mental model. So sometimes what the dancers experience is a refining of what they've accumulated. They realize from what something they experience on the floor that, oh, scoot back doesn't always happen in waves. He just had the heads star through, touch a quarter, and scoot back, and they just did it in that little box in the middle. Isn't that neat? And all of a sudden, all that stuff they had in their head that it has to be done from waves goes away, hopefully. Now, the fourth thing that the dancer can experience against this framework when they encounter the call next is that it could be contradicted. In other words, something seems to be expected on the floor that this mental model just does not account for at all. In fact, maybe the mental model even speaks against that result. That's not a good thing. And if you've done a really good job, then maybe they'll have the confidence to say, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. And in fact, sometimes they do that even when this guy does know what he's doing. You can't scoot back with mixed sexes going in. How often? You can't do that from here. How often have you heard that? And even if you did a good teach on scoot back, if they have, through subsequent repetitions, absorbed the idea that it has to be just the boys going in, or at the very least it has to be the same sex going in, you get that reaction because they've now modified the mental model that they had to be, it can't ever be a boy and a girl going in to do the turn. And you can't do that from here. I mean, I'm sure you've all heard that line from a dancer when you do something that they haven't seen before. Well, yeah, if you don't hear it, you sure see it on their faces. So you want to try and avoid contradicting their mental model unless you have to kind of decide what you're going to do about that. Because clearly, if their mental model is wrong, if there's something about their mental model that is just not accurate according to the way the call is really used, do you try and fix that? Well, if they're your dancers, you sure try and fix it. But if you're calling to somebody else's club, well, he taught them wrong. What am I supposed to do? Do I leave them in their state of blissful ignorance? Or do I try and help them out so that if they go to somebody else, they don't get killed again? It's a tough question that I'm not going to address. Okay. So we give them a framework. Every time they encounter the call again, they either reinforce it, they extend it, they refine it, or they contradict it. And that's going on every time they hear the call after that. every single circumstance for the call. So let's look at what that means for the way we teach. This initial framework is obviously really important. So as I said, the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we design our teach to try and include all or as many of the elements as we can for visual learners, auditory learners, kinesthetic learners, people who read, and make sure that we give as much repetition of each of those exposures as we can as part of the teach. We want to provide the optimal amount of information about the call. Optimal is a very carefully chosen word. It's the Goldilocks effect, right? You got to have not too much, not too little, just the right amount. Because if you give them too little, then obviously some subsequent encounters are going to be nasty surprises. If you give them too much, you can see their eyes glaze over before you get finished, and they just get overwhelmed and they get depressed. I'll never be able to learn this damn call. I remember an incident. A new concept had just come out, and this was on a C3 floor or something. It was called the Grand Working Concept. You've probably actually done some of this, although it wasn't named that. And it had just come out, and Eric Brocious, who's a very well-known, well-regarded dancer in the Boston area, had written this paper, 4-page paper, on how this concept worked. And Clark Baker decided that the optimal way to teach us was going to be, he had us all squared up, put us in a position, and he starts to read the paper. Now, those of you who know who Clark is, he's a pretty funny guy. But he figured this was going to work. And he got about 2/3 of the way down the first page before the first hysterical tittering started. Because we couldn't believe what we were hearing. We're standing there on the floor, and he's talking about pairwise trading this, you know, and there was all this mathematical language, which I'm sure was very descriptive, but we're all standing there on the floor. We had no idea what he's talking about. And it wasn't until the hysterical tittering went on that Clark looked up, and what? You know, what's going on? So that was an example of way too much information. He wasn't saying anything that wasn't unimportant. I mean, it all had to do with how this thing worked, and sure enough, when you read the paper later in the comfort of your own study with a drink, it made eminent sense. But there on the floor, that was not the right way to go at it. So you have to figure out what do I need to present to the dancers so that this thing they build in their head is going to be accurate yet concise. It needs to be the smallest possible representation of that call that will do the job of allowing them to execute it, hopefully in as many situations as possible. So to go back to the scoot back thing that I keep leaning on, if you were teaching scoot back, would you teach the quarter tag version at the same time as you teach the box version? Yes? Somebody does that? How does it work for you? I'm not saying that in a flip way. You know, how does it work for you? Wait a minute. I just remembered on the mic. Where's the mic? Hello? Yeah, it
works. Thank you. Michael Maltonford. Actually, it's not something, it's something that I've thought of doing because I just taught scoot chain through that way, which is an A2 call, also quarter tag or waves. And the reason I started doing it, and the reason I want to do it, but I haven't had a chance yet, everyone does that extend, trade, extend. And I just had an idea that, that works really well for scoot chain through. Everyone does the extend, swing, slip, swing, extend. And what I like about it and the framework that I was trying to build in the dancers is, oh, everyone learns one thing. And then later when we do it from a box or waves, some people are doing that and some people have to learn something else.
Well, it's interesting that you brought that up because I have heard some people describe the way they teach scoot back as extend, the people who meet in the middle with right hands trade, and the outsides you turn back, and everybody extend. Think about that. Works from both places. It's not the, quote, definition of the call. I mean, you read the definition of the call, it ain't that. But in fact, if you implant that as the mental model, then that dancer has a mental model that works from both places. And you don't have to sort of reteach the call when you go to this other formation that just looks so different. I mean, quarter tag to most dancers has nothing to do with a box of four. Right? They see no similarities there at all. So that's an example of taking a description of the call, which doesn't really match the rule, in the sense that if you took that description and tried to find, where the words in the definition match, they don't. But in fact, if that's the way the dancer conceives of the call, it works in both places. Now, I don't teach it that way because I discovered that trying to get dancers to extend and U-turn back and do that evaluation and whatnot was harder than effectively teaching it as two different calls. They didn't compute for my dancers anyway. And I think whether you take an approach like that or do something maybe more conventional depends a lot on your assessment of how the dancers you've got in front of you are going to react, how they've already been trained. There's if their training has led them to think in more abstract terms about calls, then that kind of a teach with the extend and the trade and all that can work quite well. But if their training has led them to think of it as more of a case-by-case thing, which I think is more common, where, okay, I've seen it from here, I've seen it from here, I've seen it from here, I've seen it from here. The definition is I've got 4 places that I know how to do this call from. How many people think most dancers work that way? That's the way most dancers are actually working. And in fact, the only processing they ever do with the definition is if they get a case they've never seen before. Then system 2 kicks in and says, well, I know 5 cases and this ain't one of them. What's the definition of this call again? And you start sort of working your way through it, and hopefully whatever you've got in your head is enough that you can figure out how this new situation needs to operate. Oh, you're just holding the mic. And I should have said this at the beginning. I usually say this at the beginning of my presentations. I prefer them to have some measure of interactiveness so that I don't go to sleep.
Repeat that again, please.
Repeat the way of teaching scoot back. So teach it as, imagine the box of 4 situation. So you got people looking into the box. It's a mini wave box of 4. Got people looking into the box, people looking out of the box. So if everybody extends, now presumably they already know extend, right? Now if you're teaching from mainstream, they only know extend from a quarter tag. So you have to have really taught them extend. Oh no, we went off the list. And maybe if when they designed the teaching order in the list, if they noticed that this was a possible way to scoot back, they may have changed where they put the full extend. Why does it need to be plus? I don't understand. Anyway, but they need to know how to really do an extend. So that gives you the situation where the people that were looking out have stepped out into nothingness, and the people looking in now have an inside hand. Okay, so the people that have the hand do a trade, people looking out, you turn back, and now you extend again, and that's the quarter tag type of extend that the mainstream dancers are familiar with.
How do the people looking out know which way to do your U-turn back?
They actually don't, but it doesn't matter. It matters if you put a roll on it. Okay, you want to get technical? Can you scoot back and roll? Who can roll? Only the people who did the run part, right? And of course, if you teach it that way, they're not running. They did a U-turn back. Or maybe I wouldn't even use the word U-turn back, because that's a call. It has a technical definition, which maybe if they're really sharp dancers, they absorbed. And it has all kinds of information in it about which direction to turn, doesn't it? U-turn back says you turn towards your partner unless you have body flow. In that case, you turn in the direction of body flow. If you don't have body flow and you don't have a partner, you turn towards the center. And if you don't have a center, then it doesn't matter. You just turn however you like. I mean, that's a big technical definition for something really simple. Guy? Oh, Mike has a question. Sorry.
Mike Sikorsky. Years ago, when I had more hair and none of it was gray, I tried that U-turn back thing on for the outfacers on the scoot back, and I found that if a guy had learned that the boy always had to come back to the end of a wave, he went to the end even if it was left-handed. And I found that even if they got it right-handed, as soon as I tried to do it left-handed, it didn't matter which arm they turned with, they had to come back to a right hand. So I am definitely adamantly opposed to the U-turn back teach on scoot back.
And I mean, Mike has an excellent point there. I mean, that is a really good example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. They absorbed a bunch of information about how that call was supposed to end that you never taught, right? You, heaven forfend, you teach it that way, that, you know, the boy always winds up on the end or whatever. But they absorbed it that way. And in fact, even when you teach it the traditional way from the mini wave boxes and whatnot, what happens when you try and do it left-handed? A bunch of them go into their right hand. And you're screaming, no, it's the inside hand, it's the inside hand, you morons. I mean, did I say that with my outside voice, you know? You know, and even though you're cueing it to death, they go in with this, it's this hand. I know it's this hand. And it doesn't matter who I'm working with, it's this hand. That's what they've got in their mental model. So it's really important to figure out how you can teach it to minimize that kind of stuff. You can't eliminate it because they're going to accumulate information on you, and we all do things we're not even aware of, and they're going to pick up on it, and they're going to incorporate it into the way they think about the call. And all we can do is recognize, as Mike did, that you do this U-turn back thing, you're opening yourself to that danger, you're making it worse. I don't think it takes it away to teach it, you know, in the traditional way, but it minimizes it or it reduces it. Guy had another question?
Yeah, Guy Steele, Lexington, Massachusetts. I've had some experience with a variant of the U-turn back method, which is to say everyone extend or step forward. If you met somebody, trade, and if you didn't, trade anyway with the person who isn't there, so doing a phantom trade, and then the final extend. And that, again, because of that final extend, people get to think that nobody can roll.
Yeah.
With either U-turn back
Right.
method or this phantom trade method.
Yeah.
However, I've found while this method is probably not good for the initial teach, there are some people who are just not getting it, where exposing them to
Where
this
it makes
alternate
sense.
idea does help
Yeah.
afterwards as a secondary teach.
Yeah. And I mean, that's another good point, too, that, you know, some people are going to get whatever you say right away, and other people will get it eventually, and some people will never get it the way you're saying it. And for those people, you have to try and figure out, how can I say it, how can I describe it to them so that it makes sense for the way they process information and the conception they have of the way calls work. The more calls you teach, I mean, sometimes when you're teaching higher levels, and dancers have got a lot of experience behind them now, you know, they've got a lot of calls. For some calls, you have to really beat some of their prior understanding out of them before you can get them to understand what's going on now, because, you know, some new call goes against the grain of what they've learned about calls in general later or earlier. And so sometimes you have to kind of disabuse them of whatever you think you know, you don't. You know, this is different. Okay, let me move on. So, a comment?
Yeah, Ken Sale, Castro Valley, California. I'd like to know what you think about something that I experienced first as a dancer and would like to understand how to fix or help people with as a caller. There have been calls where my internal definition, the first part was panic, then do something. And now I see dancers that get that habit. What are your thoughts?
That their first reaction is panic? Yeah, I'm one of those dancers. I can think of several calls that's the first part of the call for me. Oh, you know what? Again, I mean, it depends on what it is about the call that's making them panic. that's something I think you can only do on a case-by-case basis, because for some people, the reason they're panicking is because they didn't really understand the first teach, and it's just stuck with them. Like I know Pam said that she hated the call percolate on the C1 list for years and years after she learned it and she could do it, just because there was something about it that she didn't understand at first. And even though she beat her way through it many times after that, that feeling stuck. So her first reaction was always, oh, you know what. In other cases, the reason they're panicking is because the call requires them to do something they find hard. So, for instance, one that gets me, I keep using calls that are probably not very generally known in this room. There's a call called bell tie and bow tie, which requires you to identify at the very beginning of the call whether you're a bow or a bell. I don't find that easy. So that's my reaction as soon as I hear this bow tie. Oh, crap, am I a bow or a bell? I guess I'm maybe a bow. Now, what's the rule of the call if I'm a bow? And, of course, what system am I using while I'm doing that? And so maybe to sort of abstract what's going on out of that, as soon as the dancer realizes system one ain't going to handle this, that's when the panic starts to set in. And they start scrambling around in system two trying to figure out if they have enough information about the call that they could mash together in another way that would make it work for them, that they can work their way through this. But while that's happening, they're not dancing to the music anymore. So for an individual dancer, you have to find out where the nature of the panic is, and then maybe you can figure out how to talk them through it, like how to give them something to eliminate the panic. Sometimes you just can't. I know where my panic's coming from, and I can't fix it.
Walter Bro, Birmingham, Alabama. My wife had, I call those blind spot calls because, give you an example, simple. It can be a very simple call too. My wife had a problem with Zoom, and as soon as she heard the word Zoom, she'd just freeze, and it just took a time over and over again to get her to get that, what you're calling a mental image in her mind now. Yeah. And that's what it is. It seems like everybody, and I've had dancers, everybody seems to have a blind spot call where they just freeze as soon as they hear the call.
Yeah. Happens to us all. One more question, and then I'm going to move on. I see Gary has his hand on. Oh, Abe had his hand. Oh, sorry. I just realized that you'd.
Abe Feldman, Washington, D.C. When you were talking about what people had already learned with dealing with a call, Scootback's a good example. By the time you've gotten to Scootback, you're already about over 50 calls into the list. People, without realizing it, had learned that you alternate hands. And invariably, when you teach Scootback, some of them are going to go in with their left hand because they're not used to going from right hand to right hand. And when I learned it, our teacher saw that coming. He knew people were going to do that, and he immediately told them, don't go in with the other hand. He talked about doing a swivel hip, and he anticipated that some of them will have already learned that tendency, and he accounted for it.
Excellent point.
Gary Felton, Maryland. I found that as a dancer first, one of the things that panicked me was I'd never seen this kind of thing before. It's something that we're not used to seeing, so I don't have a context to put it in. For me, there was a brand new experimental that came out. It was called Spin the Top. I'd never seen end-to-end waves before. I didn't think I belonged where it put me. I see dancers have the same thing happen to them when we tell them to circulate, and they're in inverted lines, they're in T-bones or something like that. This isn't a wave. How do I circulate? It's out of context for them. It's part of their model that either needs refinement or never got built right.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. They've built a context which limits the way they think about the call. I'm going to make this the last question because I've got 15 minutes left, and I'm about a quarter of the way through my presentation.
All right, real quick. Susan Morris from the Seattle area. I find a lot of the panic comes from they missed the very first teach of that call. And dancers would say, I don't get that call. I go, were you there the first night we went through it? And they go, no. And so sometimes it's doing the second teach the same as the first teach helps them get over that.
Okay.
Dottie Welch, going back to the Zoom and this whole issue, I think if somebody's developed panic about a call, you need to reset the trigger in their head. And here's the one for Zoom. Back of the bus.
That's I have a story about teaching Zoom, but let me go through the academic stuff here. And so I talked about presenting the optimal amount of information. So what the dancers actually need to know about a call in order to be able to do it. So I'm basically going to read this. They need to know the name of the call. Seems to be fairly obvious. Teach them the name of the call first. I know that there's a lot of people favor the method of, especially if you've got a call that's made up of, other calls that they know that you can just sort of assemble. They'll cue them through the thing a few times and they'll say, oh, you just did an AC-doocy or whatever it is. That can work, but when people learn something, especially where you learn a name and then you have to accumulate information around that name, it's better to have the name first. That gives our brain the tag for the filing system. It says, okay, when you hear this, then all this stuff gets retrieved from memory. So give them the name first so they've got the empty folder to start putting the information in. How many people does it take to do this call? And that is probably the most common misperception that dancers unconsciously acquire. How many people does it take to do a pass-through? Just takes 2. But a lot of dancers have trouble with it unless it's done from a couples situation. Right? How many people does it take to do a slide-through? 2. But how come, if it doesn't end in facing lines or a normal 8 chain, that it ain't right? But people accumulated the information that it's not really a 2-person call, it's an 8-person call. And they will do that unconsciously every time. So you have to take very conscious steps to make sure that they really understand how many people are involved in this call. Because what you want them to do is, as soon as they hear that call, shrink their universe down to the people they need to work with. Just block everybody else out. Because there's a lot of calls where you're doing something with your little group and other people are doing something else. And if you pay attention to them, then you're going to get confused. I mean, this context can be really subtle. Take fan the top. If you do fan the top from waves, eventually you get them so they can do it. Then call it from a 2-face line. What happens? It's death, right? Death. And I remember one of the first Aussie tempo records I ever heard had the figure on it, heads lead right, veer to the left, fan the top. And I went, whoa, boy, are they brave. It was a really nice figure. It was heads lead right, veer to the left, fan the top, wheel and deal, reverse flutter to a Dixie style, and I can't remember what happened after that. But, I mean, really nice piece of flow. It was great. Never get the floor through that. Never. And I used that figure a few times, but you had to workshop it for the whole tip before you got to the singer. You'd never get them through it. Why should that be different? Well, it's because the dancers, the centers are so used to the idea, and the ends are so used to the idea that they're going to be walking in opposite directions, that when they actually start to move in the same direction, they go, what? You coming with me? And it just throws them off. And now the end doesn't know how far to go anymore because, I was looking at this person and they were starting to move 3/4 and so they overshoot and it's just death. And yet it's exactly the same rule for both parts of the call. It's just that slight change in the formation. Why should that make a difference? So in that case, you want to tell the people for their part of the call who are they working with. If you're an end, you're not working with the center at all. Forget them. It doesn't matter where they are. You ever done fan the top from a diamond? You can do it from diamonds because the ends and the centers are actually working independently. So in that case, you want to identify to the ends, pay no attention to what the centers are doing. Centers is a little easier because they got somebody to hang on to. Right? It's always comfort and hanging on to somebody and hoping they know what they're doing. So make sure that they know how many people are in the call and what formations they might be in. Sometimes that's hard because some calls are really flexible. They can be done from all over the place. But as much as possible, give them a good idea of where to hunt for those people so that they know who they're working with. Tell them what roles are involved in the call. And by that I mean what they have to identify themselves to be in order to figure out what to do. Are they an end or a center? Are they a leader or a trailer? Are they a bow or a bell? I know those are words that are on the A2 list, and we're not supposed to use them below A2, but they're just designators. They just tell people where they are. So are they a left side dancer or a right side dancer? Those are all roles. If you read our definitions, for the most part, they're written that way, where they describe the call in terms of, if I'm in this position, I have this role does this action. So they need to, and that's something as you're teaching your dancers right from square one, you need to be inculcating that kind of thought. And the way you do that is by teaching in this consistent way. So tell them what roles are involved in the call, what actions each role plays, and the points in the call at which their roles may change. So they have to know about parts. Now, like I come out of a challenge background, often when I start talking about, well, you got to know the parts of a call, they think, well, that's because you want to take it apart. You want to do, 2/3 of the call, 3/4 of the call. No, they have to know the parts of the call because if you're teaching spin the top, they have to know that after the first part of the call, they have to figure out whether they're an end or a center to do the second part of the call. So they have to know that it has two parts. They have to know that they have to evaluate their role for the first part, even though it's the same for everybody, right? You just trade with the adjacent person. But after that, you need to know whether you're an end or a center, and you have different parts. So they need to know the parts of the call, and they need to know the points in the call at which they need to evaluate their role to decide what they're going to do next. And then there's some sort of additional stuff like the number of beats of music that it might take and the defaults that the call might have. Square through has a default, right? We often expect dancers to realize that if I say square through, it's going to be 4. I personally don't like doing that. I'll always give them the number if it's possible because a lot of them aren't going to remember, and you want to work for success. You also need to explain to them how to assemble the outcome of the call. And by that I mean, let's take a call like slide through. So slide through is a 2-person call. If you've taken what I've recommended here, the dancer is going to focus in on that person that they're working with, right? And they're going to execute the call. So now they're beside the person that they were working with, and they look up. But there's 3 other sets of people that were involved in that call in the square. How do you put it all back together again? So you need to give them the information about how the formation they were working in is now complete. It's a 2-person formation. How does it relate to all the other 2-person formations that are in the square? How do you put the final outcome together? Well, we know how slide through works. It ends in an 8 chain or facing lines. That's all there is, right? So they need all that information in order to do the call. Now, that sounds really daunting when you list out all that information. But in fact, you can encapsulate that in a very short kind of instruction. And the handout has that in. I'm not going to go into it. I've got some examples of teaching like spin the top and a couple of things like that. I'll leave that as an exercise for the reader. The last thing that I'm going to say about teaching, because I've got 6 minutes left, is that you should teach in a consistent format. By that I mean you've got all this information you're trying to convey. You want to try and convey it in the same way each time as much as possible, so that the dancers unconsciously will start to realize, they'll recognize that organization that you use, and they'll start to look for the information that they need in the format that you present. So start with the name of the call, so they get used to the idea, okay, I'm getting an empty folder here to start putting information in. The number of people and formations next, because that's the very next thing that a dancer is going to need to know in order to start executing the call. If they can't execute the call, if they don't know how many people they're working with and where they are, have to know that. So that's the second thing you tell them about. Tell them the roles that they need to understand for the first part of the call and what the actions for those roles are. If the call has multiple parts that they need to be aware of, then for each part, you'll tell them, here's the roles that are involved in those parts. The ends do something, the centers do something, the boys do something, the girls do something, if that's indeed the way it is defined. And that at this part of the call, then you need to evaluate the situation and decide whether you're a leader or a trailer, or, whatever that kind of thing is. For each part of the call, identify the roles, tell them what the action for that role is. And then try and develop some consistent cues that you use as you're working with the call. So this pass 'em, face 'em, touch 'em thing, when I glommed onto that, that was just wonderful. And now all the it started with my dancers chanting it, and I picked it up. But now I use it everywhere that I call, and the dancers all chant it. And that gives them a really good handle on how that call works. Even the ones who were taught, well, a pass the ocean is the girls go in and they hook left hands, and they turn, and the boy goes around here. If that's the way they think of the call, it still works for them. And then when they see it sashayed for the first time, it's a lot easier for them to dissociate themselves from the earlier way they envisaged the call. Okay, so we've got the optimal amount of information that we're delivering. We're delivering in a consistent format. What's the next thing we need to worry about? That's how we repeat the use of the call. And this is something that I think a lot of us have trouble with, because we have our favorite ways to use the call, and that's all we show them. Repetition is really important, and boy, the Goldilocks rule here really applies. The first time I taught ladies chain, so I had the head ladies chain them back. I had the side ladies chain, and they chained back, and I didn't tell them to. They watched the heads do it. That's all it took. One repetition. I chained them across, I chained them back, then I chained them across. Obviously, I'm going to chain them back again. Dancers learn really quickly. They just learn the wrong things really quickly. So you need to be careful about how often you repeat something from the same situation, because remember the statistical database in their head. Every time you repeat it, it adds another count to that situation. And the more that situation outweighs all the others, eventually it comes to the point where that's the only situation that they recognize. So if you're teaching a call like scoot back, I teach scoot back as, I'll set it up just the way I talked about it, except I'll put them in a box of 4 in the middle. I'll have the head star through and then touch a quarter. So now you've got a box that the sides can look at, and the heads don't have to worry about the sides at all. And I'll do a scoot back. You've got the boy facing in to start. Do another one right away. Now the girl's facing in. And you can cue the sexes and whatnot. And then almost the very next thing I do, I'll have the sides do that, and then I'll have the heads set up the square again, have the head square through 4, the sides roll away. Got same sexes now. Touch a quarter, now you're doing the scoot back. If they see that like as the third thing that they've seen, their conception of scoot back has nothing to do with boys and girls. It has nothing to do with the sexes of who's going in. That hasn't even occurred to them, because it hasn't been built into their model yet. So you need to think about that as you're teaching the calls. How can I expose them in a way that isn't going to overwhelm them with all kinds of cases that they need to learn, but which at the same time isn't going to let them pick up this extraneous information that has nothing to do with the rule of the call. And I'm out of time. So as I said, I managed to make it to like maybe 40% of my presentation. Read the handout. I designed my handouts so that you can read them later. They're not really follow along while I talk kind of handouts. If any of it generates questions in your mind, feel free to email me. My email is barry@clasper.ca. It's not hard to remember. Or buttonhole me in the hallway here. The presentations will be on the website once they get that loaded up. I still have a few handouts out here at the front if you'd like to take them away. Thanks for your kind attention and for the interaction from the crowd. I'm thinking through this stuff myself at the moment. I don't pretend to be standing here saying I got all this weight off. I know exactly what's going on. All of this is a sort of a journey for me, a journey of exploration, and I'd love to talk to you about your thoughts about it, and I think we have something here that can really help us put a different perspective on how we think about what's going on when people are square dancing, and therefore how we teach them to do it, and how we work with them. But I just don't really have it all figured out yet, so I'd love to talk to you about that. It's not on the CD, but it will be on the website. Thanks for coming out so early in the morning, and coffee is out in the hall.